reason with people. As it just so happened, Aquila and Priscilla, they are fellow tent makers. So he just gets in there and they start working together, and they are believers in Jesus Christ working together. Okay, so verse 5, when Silas and Timothy came from Macedonia, Paul devoted himself exclusively to preaching, testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Messiah. Now, you'll notice that green line is where Silas and Timothy's route from Macedonia to Corinth. I don't know if you can see it, but of course, right above that orange line, you can see Italy. That's Italy. And that's where I met my wife, just so y'all know, okay? And then right above that green line, I don't know if you can see it in all caps, it says Macedonia. To the right, you see Thessalonica. To the right of that, you see Philippi. And so they're leaving Berea, coming down past Mount Olympus and making their way through Athens and Cenchrea to Corinth, okay? And so that's the green line is Timothy and Silas, and Paul was he didn't have that far to go with the purple line. Okay, so let's keep going. Verse 6, but when they opposed Paul and became abusive, he shook out his clothes in protest and said to them, your blood be on your own heads. I am innocent of it. From now on I will go to the Gentiles. Then Paul left the synagogue and went next door to the house of Titius Justus, a worshiper of God. Crispus, the synagogue leader, and his entire household believed in the Lord, and many of the Corinthians who heard Paul believed and were baptized. So there's a hostile crowd of Jews in this town that basically are abusive towards Paul and so forth. So he leaves. He said, I'm going to go to the Gentiles. So he leaves the synagogue, goes next door, and he begins proclaiming the gospel to the Gentiles, and they come to faith in Jesus Christ. So here's the origin story of believers in Corinth. Now we come to verse 9, and it says, one night the Lord spoke to Paul in a vision, do not be afraid, keep on speaking, do not be silent. For I am with you, and no one is going to attack and harm you, because I have many people in this city. So Paul stayed in Corinth for a year and a half. So this is how long he stays there, teaching them the word of God, we believe, roughly 18 months. While Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews of Corinth made a united attack on Paul and brought him to the place of judgment. This man they charged is persuading people to worship God in the ways contrary to the law. Now, let's stop right there for just a moment. I want you to look up at the very bottom. I don't know if you can see it. It says Achaia. Okay, that's the region. Just like Italy, you got that region. You got Macedonia, that area, and then you've got Achaia, and that's where Corinth is in that area of Achaia. So verse 14, just as Paul was about to speak, Gallio said to them, if you Jews were making a complaint about some misdemeanor or serious crime, it would be reasonable for me to listen to you. But since it involves questions about words and names and your own law, settle the matter for yourselves. I will not be a judge of such things. So he drove them off. Then the crowd there turned to Sosthenes, the synagogue leader, and beat him in front of the proconsul, and Gallio showed no concern whatsoever. So this is the first visit of Paul to Corinth. He meets Priscilla and Aquila there. Timothy and Silas come to see him. He is brought before the judgment seat, the Bema, okay, the Bema, B-E-M-A. And it's interesting that in Greece, Christians were seen as part of the Jewish world, okay? So Christians, early on, we have a big distinction between Judaism and Christianity, but in those early days, it wasn't necessarily easily distinguishable, and that was a big deal back then because those in Judaism had relief from having to participate in the emperor worship and the Roman imperial cult, okay? So here in Greece, they are being treated as though they are part of that, part of Judaism. If you go to Galatia, the Christians were trying to get in under that banner, and they wouldn't allow them in. But Gallio saw them as basically part of the same group, and so that's why he didn't really care what they did, and left them to themselves. Okay, so after Paul leaves, the church is visited by Apollos. We know that a little bit later on, chapter 18, verse 27. Apollos wanted to go to Achaia. And perhaps at some point, the Apostle Peter went there, and we know that from 1 Corinthians chapter 1, where Cephas is brought up. And some were wanting to follow Paul, some were wanting to follow Apollos, and some wanted to follow Cephas, and there were divisions within the church. So that was the first one. Talk more about that, then I'll talk about these other two. But there were at least two other visits. Any questions about the first visit, or any questions, comments so far? I believe so. Don't know 100% for sure. A lot of stuff we don't know 100% for sure, but I believe so. No, it's just Peter is, of course, the name that Jesus gave him, and Cephas is just another way to refer to him. So I don't think it has any. Peter means rock, yeah. Cephas, I need to go back and refresh my memory. It's not coming up. Somebody may know that off the top of your head. And if you go to 1 Corinthians 1 and you have a Bible commentary, it might tell you the significance of that name, because I think it's in chapter 1. Oh, goodness, that's James. Let's not do that. I think it's chapter 1, verse 10, verse 12. Okay. Yeah, it says Cephas, okay. I think it's just maybe it might be the Latin way to say. I'm drawing a blank off the top of my head. I should know that. I do know that. I've forgotten that. But it might be the Latin way to refer to his name. Okay. Okay, there's two other visits. The second one is called the painful visit. If you turn to 2 Corinthians chapter 2, 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 1, it says, 2 Corinthians 2:1, so I made up my mind that I would not make another painful visit to you. So he wrote 1 Corinthians, and sometime after 1 Corinthians, he's like, I'm just going to have to go address this myself. And so he went to Corinth, and that's what he calls his painful visit. And I think over in 2 Corinthians chapter 13, if I'm correct, 2 Corinthians chapter 13, he alludes to another visit. He says, this will be my third visit to you. Every matter must be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. I already gave you a warning when I was with you the second time, and now I repeat it while absent. On my return, I will not spare those who sinned earlier or any of the others. So he's got that first visit where he gets everything up and running over the course of about 18 months, year and a half. Okay, he goes away, hears about all this stuff going on, as we're about to see here in a minute, writes a letter to them, and then he's like, I'm just going to have to go deal with this myself. And so he goes across. In fact, I think we've got maybe another one. Go one more. Maybe I didn't include that one. Okay, well, I'll tell you what, stop right there. If you can see over to the right, okay, all the way to the right, if we were to go straight right, you see where it kind of indents? And if you go straight right, across that sea is Ephesus, okay? And that's where he wrote Corinth. And so he took a journey after he wrote 1 Corinthians to visit them for this painful visit. He went across that sea and came in to visit them in person. That's what he calls the painful visit. Things did not go well, okay? Whatever it was, it did not go well. So that was the second visit. The third visit, Paul made one final visit. We learn about it in Acts chapter 20. Acts chapter 20, verse 2 and following, where it says he traveled through that area speaking many words of encouragement to the people, and finally arrived in Greece, where he stayed 3 months because some Jews had plotted against him just as he was about to sail for Syria, and he decided to go back through Macedonia. And so it explains several of the places that he visited. So we believe that he visited 3 times. Probably one of the main reasons was to take up a collection for Jerusalem, which we'll talk more about later. Okay, let's talk about the letters that he wrote. How many letters did he write to the church at Corinth? At least 4. Okay? You say, well, I only see 2 in my Bible. Did you know 1 Corinthians is actually 2 Corinthians? Okay? 1 Corinthians is actually the second letter that he wrote to Corinth. Now, how do we know that? I don't think. Now, some scholars debate whether parts of the painful letter, okay, he had a painful visit, but if scholars debate if some of these other letters I'm about to talk about found their way into 2 Corinthians. They think it might have been included in 2 Corinthians. Okay, and we'll get to more of that later. But in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 9, 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 9, he said, I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people. Okay? Not at all meaning the people of this world who are immoral or greedy or swindlers or idolaters, and he goes on. So in other words, he's already written a letter to the church at Corinth, and a letter in which they read and misinterpreted. Now, this ought to cause us to have a little bit of humility if someone who knew the Apostle Paul personally, who spoke his language, who shared his own culture, read what he wrote and said, and they got it wrong. They got wrong what Paul wrote to them, and so he has to write back and say, no, that's not what I meant. I didn't mean not to associate with anybody sexually immoral in the world, or you wouldn't even be able to exist in this world, basically. But those in the church who claim to be followers of Christ and yet are unrepentant in their sexual immorality, those are the ones that you don't want to associate with. So that's the first letter that he wrote. Obviously now we've got that letter, and then we've got 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians is the second letter that Paul wrote to the Corinthians. In 2 Corinthians chapter 2, 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 3, we learn of a sorrowful letter. It says in chapter 2, verse 3, I wrote as I did, so that when I came I would not be distressed by those who should have made me rejoice. I had confidence in all of you that you would share my joy. Okay, and then he writes, for I wrote you out of great distress and anguish of heart, and with many tears, not to grieve you, but to let you know the depth of my love for you. So scholars believe that that is a different letter other than 1 Corinthians. All of these things are debatable. All of these things are arguable. We're trying to reconstruct the situation to the best of our ability. A little bit later on in 2 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 8, he says, even if I cause you sorrow by my letter, I do not regret it. Though I did regret it, I see that my letter hurt you, but only for a little while. Could be 1 Corinthians, but could be a different letter that he wrote them. A lot of scholars believe that this could be a different letter. And so then, of course, finally, he wrote 2 Corinthians. And so that's kind of the outline of it. He could have written 4 or more letters. And here's the thing. I would imagine when we all get to heaven and we get if we get to have a fuller picture of what went on, I think we're going to be shocked. That there were probably a lot, there was a lot more that went on in the first century that we just have no historical record of. No historical record of. Lost to history, okay? And that'll be fascinating maybe if we get to heaven and that happens. So we're just trying to reconstruct different pieces of it, but we believe that he wrote at least 4 different letters to the church at Corinth. Now, the time and place of his writing, he wrote his letter while he was in Ephesus. We know this because at the end of 1 Corinthians chapter 16, 1 Corinthians chapter 16, he mentions this in verse 5. He says, after I go through Macedonia, I will come to you. Okay, so if you look back on the screen, you see there Macedonia at the top. He's going to go back through Macedonia, make his way down again. After I go through Macedonia, I will come to you. Verse 6, perhaps I will stay with you for a while or even spend the winter so that you can help me on my journey wherever I go. For I do not want to see you now and make only a passing visit. I hope to spend some time with you if the Lord permits. But I will stay on at Ephesus until Pentecost, because a great door for effective work has been opened to me, and there are many who oppose me. So where is he writing this letter from? Ephesus. He's writing it from Ephesus. Probably 3 years after he completed his ministry in Corinth. Okay, now there's debate about who carried the letter, because they don't have a postal service. So who carried the letter to the church? A lot of people think Timothy did, because it says, chapter 16, verse 10, when Timothy comes, see to it that he has nothing to fear while he is with you, for he is carrying on the work of the Lord just as I am. So that's one possibility, is that Timothy carried it. But there's debate about that, because in Acts 19:22, Paul sent Timothy and Erastus to Macedonia while he stayed at Ephesus. And so some people think, well, that conflicts. I don't really think it conflicts, because Paul just got finished saying himself that he was going to go through Macedonia. Probably more likely is that he sent the letter through the delegation of people that came to see him. And if you notice in chapter 16, verse 15, you know that the house of Stephanas were the first converts in Achaia, and they have devoted themselves to the service of the Lord's people. I urge you, brothers and sisters, to submit to such people and to everyone who joins in the work and labors for it. So they kind of had a delegation that came from the church at Corinth to visit Paul, report on what's going on, bring him a letter from them, which we're going to talk about here in just a second. And it would make good sense for him just to send it back with them. He tried to get Apollos to do it. And if you look at chapter 16, verse 12, he tried to get Apollos to do it, and Apollos was like, I'm good. You know, it's like, I need a little break, okay? And anybody who's been in ministry for a while, you know that there's some situations and some areas or groups of people you're like, you know what, I'm going to stay over here for a little while, right? I'm going to need a little break. And so Apollos has been there. He's done that. No thanks, Paul. I'm not going to do that. Okay, get back to the occasion for the letter. What prompted him to write? Well, if you go back to chapter 1, verse 11, it says, my brothers and sisters, some from Chloe's household, have informed me that there are quarrels among you. So he's getting this report from her household. We see again in chapter 5, verse 1, that it's actually reported that there is sexual immorality among you, okay, and of a kind that even pagans do not tolerate, a man sleeping with his father's wife. We see again another report in chapter 11, verse 18, in the first place, I hear that when you come together as a church, there are divisions among you, okay? So, one thing that prompted him writing the letter is that he's getting these reports from Chloe's household. Now, probably, Chloe is obviously a female, and the fact that it's from her household, he identifies it as her household, it very well could be slaves from her household sent to the Apostle Paul, okay? Very likely could be slaves from her household that were sent, Christian slaves sent to the Apostle Paul. So that's one, is that he received reports from Chloe, or from her household. The second is that, as we've already seen in chapter 16, verse 17, you've got this delegation from the church that showed up. It says, I was glad when Stephanas, Fortunatus, and Achaicus arrived, because they have supplied what was lacking from you, for they refreshed my spirit and yours. Such men deserve recognition. Now, what did they do? You've got some from Chloe's household who've given him reports, either at the same time or at an independent time. But you've also got this delegation from the church who showed up, okay? And what do you think happened when they showed up? Well, it says that they made up for your lacking. So they brought an offering to the Apostle Paul. They bring an offering to the Apostle Paul. But they also brought something else that's not mentioned in 1 Corinthians 16. And what do you think that is? They brought reports of what's coming on at the church, but even something more tangible. It says in chapter 7, verse 1, everything begins to take a shift in the letter. In chapter 7, verse 1, he says, "Now for the matters you wrote about." So they showed up. They probably had some reports, some things going on in the church. Here's an offering, here's some money, and oh, by the way, here's a letter from the church. So now, wouldn't it be cool? We're reading Paul's letter, and that's all we get to do is we read Paul's letter. But what if we had some of these nasty debates in church and like, you know what we're going to do? You know what we're going to do? We're going to write the Apostle Paul a letter. We're going to let him settle this matter for us, right? And so that's what they did. Paul went and visited them, and he left. And a year or two goes by, and things begin to kind of develop and go haywire and go different ways in the church. And they got divisions in the church. They're like, you know what? We're going to write a letter, and we're going to send a group to give this letter to the Apostle Paul on behalf of the church. And we're going to let him settle this issue for us. And that's what they did. And so, as you see multiple times after chapter 7, he'll say, "now concerning." Okay, so the first one, he says in chapter 7, verse 1, "now for the matters you wrote about." After that, he shortens it to "now concerning." And he says it again in chapter 7, verse 25. Some English translations draw this out more than others, but it says, "now about virgins." So he's going to address another topic. He says it again in chapter 8, verse 1. "Now about food sacrificed to idols." So he's going point by point, things that they've written about, and he's addressing them. I'll give you all of them, and you can just write them down. Chapter 7, verse 1, chapter 7, verse 25, chapter 8, verse 1, chapter 11, verse 2, chapter 12, verse 1, chapter 15, verse 1, and chapter 16, verse 1. All of these, he's going to address something that they wrote to him about. And as we will see, sometimes he quotes them, he quotes what they believe, and then he corrects it, or he gives his perspective on it. We see it in chapter 7, verse 1, where he says, "now for the matters you wrote about," and then he quotes them, "it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman." Now, does anybody's Bible not have that in quotations? If you have a King James Version, probably not in quotations. Chapter 7, verse 1. Anybody have a translation where it doesn't have that in quotation marks? Yours doesn't? Okay. So some don't. And this is the first of these that were discovered by scholars. We'll talk about this more later. I find this absolutely fascinating because they didn't have punctuation like we do. And so a lot of these scholars are still determining some of the things that maybe they wrote in their letter that he quotes them, and then he's going to respond to it. Some of them are easily identified. Chapter 7, verse 1 is the first one of these that were identified. Others are highly controversial, as we're going to see as we get there. Okay, but so putting all this together, you've got a group from the things are happening in Corinth. Things are not going well. They've got these divisions. They've got these quarrels. They begin to write a letter. We're going to send this to the Apostle Paul. Either this delegation goes along with those from Chloe's household, or they go independently of one another. We're not exactly sure on that. But they go. They bring reports to the Apostle Paul. This other group brings an offering, a donation for his ministry or for the church at Jerusalem, and a letter from the church. So now he's got these reports. Now he's got this letter. Now he's about to put pen to paper, and he's about to write 1 Corinthians in response to these things. And so he wrote to address their questions about marriage and celibacy, food sacrificed to idols, spiritual gifts, the collection, Apollos' return, and other things as well. And so he's writing also in light of the news he received about divisions, sexual immorality, the dress of women, disorderly worship, and denial of the resurrection. So he's got a lot of ground to cover, okay? It's not like, we got this one problem, can you settle this for us? It's like, everything's going wrong, and we need you to deal with this, okay? Help us navigate through this. Okay, real quickly, what about Corinth? What do we know about Corinth? Corinth was the capital city of the Roman province of Achaia. You can probably still see it up there. No, go back. Okay, yeah, right there. You can see Achaia at the bottom, and you can see right, I tell you what, go back one more. You can probably see this one better. Yeah, you can see Corinth right there, Cenchrea, which, of course, is where Phoebe in Romans chapter 16 is mentioned. So you've got Corinth right there, and it's in the Isthmus Pass. We'll talk about that here in just a second. But it's set at the foot of a limestone mountain called Acrocorinth. It was destroyed by the Romans in 146 B.C. and later rebuilt by Julius Caesar in 44 B.C. and colonized by Roman freedmen. The population is funny going from commentary to commentary. They don't know what the population was, okay? They don't have the foggiest clue. But the more conservative number was 80,000 in Corinth proper with 20,000 in surrounding villages. You read the next commentary, it says 150 to 300,000 with plus 460,000 slaves. So those are two wildly different estimations. So maybe it's somewhere in the middle. It was a big city, especially for those days. Today, we think, well, it's not all that big of a city. In those days, it would have been a really big city. It's located in a very ideal place on the Isthmus. I never can say that. Anyway, I was going to say a Mike Tyson joke, but I'm not going to do that. So there's two halves of Greece. There's the Attica North and Peloponnese South, right in between those. So it's kind of a bridge between East and South Greece. And also you've got the Aegean Sea on one side, the Ionian Sea on the other. And they tried to build, you can see where there's sea on both sides, and they tried even up to Paul's day to build a canal to make it from one side to the other, because it's very dangerous apparently, and especially in those days, the sea going around the horn of, or whatever, going around Achaia down there in the south, very dangerous. And so they actually tried to build a canal from one sea to the next. Even in Paul's day, they were trying to build, always failed, but never give up, folks, because in the 1920s, they finally got it built, okay? So it only took them into the 1900s to finally get this built. But before that, because it was so dangerous, many of them would put their boats on, and they would drag them 6 miles from one sea to the next, and that's just what they would do. On logs, yeah, on logs, that's right. So yeah, the city is kind of a hybrid. It's on the one hand, it's got a Roman administration. It's got Roman architecture. Achaeans, natives of the land, could not hold office. But the Jews settled there, as we can see in Acts chapter 18. They may have been the first settlers there. Read one commentary that said that. But because it was a port city, you've got people coming in and out constantly, transient society. Travelers definitely supported the colony. I like this one comment from Kiempa and Rossner. It says, Corinth was prosperous, cosmopolitan, and religiously pluralistic, accustomed to visits by impressive, traveling public speakers, and obsessed with status, self-promotion, and personal rights. Okay, so that's kind of what the city was about. As with any city, it would have a high population of poor people and a few who were wealthy at the same time. Cult prostitution was common, stuff like that. It had, in terms of the Olympic Games, whatever they had there, I think it had a name for it. The Isthmian Athletic Games, and it was second, I think, only to the Olympics, and involved a celebration of the god Poseidon. Like what Gordon Fee says about them, he says, more than any other New Testament location, the various sociological, economic, and religious factors that make up the environment of the city of Corinth have a profound influence on one's understanding of Paul's letters to the church there. Okay, I'm not going to read this next thing. I'll save that for later. Let's talk about their social situation, and then we've got just a minute to look at the opening verse. Let's go to the next chart real quick. Go one more over, or actually two more over. Okay, yeah, let's look at that one. Okay, that's kind of how the city was set up. You can see the theater there. You can see that word bema. That's where, in fact, you can go there, from what I understand, if anybody's been to Corinth, you can go there to this day and see where Paul was, see that place where Paul was brought before Gallio and judged, and where Sosthenes was beaten, all that sort of stuff. But that's kind of how the city was arranged. You can see the Temple to Octavia. You've got the Temple of Apollo. And all of these temples to Greek gods, very secular society. You can see the theater over there. Yes, that's just kind of how it was set up. Now let's talk about the makeup of the church, okay? The makeup of the church. You would have had probably a few wealthy and mostly poor and slaves. But you did have a diverse congregation. If we could go over to the next slide. Okay, so this is kind of how some things that we know about the social status of Corinth, of the Corinthian congregation. On the one hand, you've got a director of public works, Erastus, so that could be kind of a high-level position. You've got a synagogue leader, Crispus. You've got the heads of households, Crispus, Stephanas, Chloe. You've got those capable of service and benefaction to Paul, Gaius, Titus, Justus, Phoebe. You've got merchants of artisans, Aquila and Priscilla. You've got laborers and destitute who have nothing, unnamed. You got slaves. So you've got a diverse congregation. You've got those who are wealthy, probably still the minority, but they're there. And you've got a lot of poor and slaves. And what you should take away from all that is, while we may be used to the wealthy and the common folks kind of interacting in different genders and different ethnicities and all this sort of stuff, we've had a few thousand years to get used to that. They had exactly, it was unprecedented. And now they're all in one congregation. You can see the mess that's created in 1 Corinthians 11 with the Lord's Supper, where some are just literally getting drunk and indulging themselves while others are going away hungry. Okay, because they didn't have any, we would just be appalled if we went to a church and we saw that today. Okay, they had none of that. Okay, and so they had to figure all that out for themselves. By the way, this comes from a book by N.T. Wright and Michael Bird, The New Testament in Its World, that chart there. Okay, wrap it up, and then we'll be done. Outline of the book, really simple. Outline of this book is really simple. The introduction is chapter 1, verses 1 through 9. That's the introduction. That's the greeting. That's the Thanksgiving. That's the hello, how's everybody doing? Starting in verse 10, things take a turn, and he reproves them because of reports he got from Chloe's household. From chapter 1, verse 10, all the way to chapter 6, verse 20, all the way through chapter 6. So, he's going to reprove them or correct them based upon the reports he received from Chloe's household. After that, chapter 7, verse 1, that's where things took a turn, and he begins to address questions raised from the letter. So then he moves from correcting them for the reports he received from Chloe's household to replying to the letter and addressing issues in the letter. And that runs from chapter 7, verse 1, all the way to chapter 16, verse 9. And then the conclusion, chapter 16, verses 10 through 24. Okay. I told you the last 10 minutes would be like normal, but next week we'll just start normal, okay? So all of this was a little different than usual. Some of you were loving the historical stuff, and you love that kind of thing. Some of you are like, okay, let's just get to verse 1. Let's start working our way through, right? And I'm somewhere in between. I love both of them. But hopefully this gives you background information. We're going to learn more and more going through. I just thought it'd be helpful to all at once give it to you, and that way we can draw from this as we go through. Got just a couple of minutes. Do you have questions or comments? Absolutely. Aramaic. Okay, I knew it was something to do with either Latin or something, and so it's Aramaic. Cephas is Aramaic for rock. We'll say more about that probably not next week, but the next week when we actually get to that verse, and then I'll know what I'm talking about once I get there. Could be, but I think probably the character. There's some people when they come and they want to say something about somebody else, you're like, okay, and you're going to leave here and you're probably going to go say something bad about me, because they lack credibility. But there's some people, if they come and sit down in my office and they say, Brother Jared, I've got a concern about such and so, I don't question the intent that they genuinely care for them, for the church. They're not trying to stir up trouble because that's not their character, that's not their way. And I would just imagine that Paul he knew this delegation that came from the church. He knew their character, their credibility, and so it carried weight with him, that they're not just gossiping, that they came with real concerns, and it's like, I hear this about you, and here you go. And apparently Chloe didn't mind her name being used, or at least she knew she was taking that risk, that when this letter comes back, everybody's going to know that Chloe's household is the one who sent this information to Paul, and that's why we are just getting this letter correcting us. Yes? Yes. And if they had divisions, you imagine some of them knew Paul had credibility, and that's why they went to Paul. Some were like, well, when can Apollos come back? And then others obviously wanted Cephas, but yes. In the early days of the church, it was a lot more kind of wild, wild west. You would imagine that they would have elders at the church, lead them. That's kind of how Paul did things. He went in, he got things started, you appoint elders, but we also know that he's sending Timothy around, Titus around, appointing overseers, elders in various places to set up leadership. And so you kind of imagine when these churches got started, they're still trying to figure this out. How are we going to operate? And the whole elder system kind of comes from the way that they used to run the synagogues. Elder literally just means older, okay? And generally speaking, for a long time, synagogue, you got the older people who are older, they're wiser, that they are generally the ones who are going to provide leadership. But that's not always the case. We know that sometimes there are older people who are not mature enough to run anything. And then sometimes you have younger people who are wise beyond their years. They're ready to lead. And so there's outliers on both sides. Timothy's one example. Don't let them look down upon you because you're young. So elder literally meant older person, but it came to mean just a general term for leaders within the church. And you would imagine that they would have leaders. We'll learn more about that as we go through, but apparently their leadership wasn't doing great. By the time he wrote 1 Corinthians, we're talking maybe just a few years. Yeah, I think 3 years. Yes, sir. Right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And so it's kind of like Acts 6. We've got this problem with some of the Hellenistic Jews not getting served, and so we're going to adapt. We're going to innovate. We're going to come up with a solution for that problem. And if you look at it, those that went to serve them all had Hellenistic names, and so it was people they would feel safe with, familiar with, that would go to them and serve. And so we're reading in the first century them trying to figure this whole church thing out. Okay. All right, I want to be respectful of everybody's time at 7:18, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to pray. If you have some pressing question that you won't sleep well tonight if you don't ask, Ben is right over here, Ben Ship, and he would love to take that question for you. No, feel free to come up and ask, and I'll do what I can. But thank you for being here tonight. Like I said, next week it'll be a lot more like usual. We'll dive right into 1 Corinthians, maybe just a small recap of some of this, and then we're off and running, okay? So let's pray, and then we will be dismissed. Gracious Father, thank you for tonight. Thank you for such a great crowd. Pray that they come back, and we all stick it out through this letter. So many powerful, beautiful, profound truths in 1 Corinthians that I pray that we would take to heart and learn from. Father, I'm thankful for your love and your kindness, and that you raised up people like the Apostle Paul to write these letters and challenge us and enlighten us to your grace and your love. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.